Imagine being born into a world where every moment of your life was controlled, where freedom was not even a dream but an unknown word. For millions of black men, women, and children in early America, this was not imagination, it was daily life. They lived under a system designed to strip them of dignity, silence their voices, and use their bodies for labor and profit. Families were torn apart, children grew up in fear, and even the basic hope of living a long life was stolen. Most people today are told a version of history that mentions slavery in passing, as though it were just another chapter in a textbook. But what often gets left out is the devastating reality behind those words. To be enslaved in America meant living under constant hardship and suffering. It was not simply about working in fields or following orders, it was about enduring endless cruelty and surviving in conditions that no human being should ever face. The truth is stark. While white Americans of that era could expect to live into their 40s, the average life expectancy of someone born into slavery was barely half of that. This wasn't just due to poor living conditions, it was because people were denied proper food, medical care, and rest. They were treated not as human beings but as tools that could be used and discarded. Every day was a battle against exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Think of the children born into such a system. From their very first breath, their futures were already decided for them. Many did not survive their first year of life. Those who did grew up under the shadow of chains, raised to accept that their only purpose was to serve others. They learned quickly that even their bodies did not belong to them. What kind of childhood is that? What kind of world teaches a child that hope is dangerous? And yet, within all this darkness, there was a light that could never be completely extinguished. Enslaved people found ways to sing songs that carried coded messages of survival. They whispered stories of freedom, kept alive their faith, and built strength in their communities. Their resilience was extraordinary, even when the system tried to erase every part of their identity. This history is not easy to hear. It forces us to confront the reality of how much suffering was hidden behind America's growth and prosperity. But to understand the present, we must face the past. These lives mattered, their pain mattered, and their courage deserves to be remembered. That is why this channel exists, not just to tell stories, but to uncover truths that were buried for too long. If you believe these stories should be heard, if you think history should never be silenced, then help us spread this message. Please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can make sure that these voices are never forgotten again. On a quiet night in the American South, long before electricity lit the roads or engines rumbled through the fields, the sound of metal often carried through the darkness. It wasn't the sound of tools or farming equipment. It was the dragging of chains, heavy iron links clinking with each reluctant step. Those chains were not for animals or machinery, they were fastened to people. Men, women, even children, bound together, forced to carry the weight of both iron and despair. To understand this history, we have to step into the daily reality of those who lived through it. The chains were not simply restraints, they were symbols. Symbols that told a person, day after day, that they were not free to move as they wished. Around the neck, wrists, or ankles, the metal pressed into skin, leaving marks that lasted long after the iron was gone. Imagine waking each morning to the scrape of cold steel, a reminder before even the first meal that life was not your own. And then there were the muzzle-like devices, constructed not for animals, but specifically for people. These contraptions were fitted around the head and mouth, designed to silence. To wear one meant losing not just the ability to speak, but the ability to eat or drink comfortably. A person's most basic human actions, talking, laughing, or sharing a meal, were cut off. Silence was enforced not by choice, but by metal. These devices didn't just restrain, they humiliated. They turned people into walking displays of powerlessness, meant to send a message to everyone who saw them: resistance would not be tolerated. Food was another tool of control. Hunger was not simply the result of scarcity, it was sometimes deliberately imposed. Meals were meager and often insufficient to sustain the endless labor required in the fields. Rations of cornmeal, beans, or scraps of meat were all that many had to live on. The weakness that followed hunger wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. A hungry person is easier to manage, less able to resist, less able to dream of escape. In this way, starvation became a weapon, cutting into body and spirit alike. Then came the iron weights. These were attached to the ankles of those considered likely to run, heavy blocks that made each step exhausting. Walking even a short distance became a painful ordeal. The weights dragged against the ground, slowing every movement, reminding the person that even if their mind longed for freedom, their body was bound to the earth. Escape was nearly impossible with such burdens. The iron did not just hold people back physically, it also broke their will, teaching them that freedom was too far, too heavy to carry. What is most chilling is how ordinary all of this became. For those who held power, these acts of restraint and deprivation were not seen as cruelty. They were viewed as part of daily life, routine measures to ensure obedience. Chains, muzzles, hunger, and weights were woven into the rhythm of plantations and households. They were accepted, normalized, even justified by those who benefited from them. To look at these practices is to confront the terrifying idea of how society can grow accustomed to injustice, how cruelty can be disguised as necessity. But let us not only picture the tools, let us picture the people who bore them. Picture a young boy, no older than 10, stumbling under the drag of iron shackles too large for his small frame. Imagine a woman, her head enclosed in a muzzle-like device, unable to comfort her crying child with words. Envision an older man, his body weakened by years of work and little food, yet still forced to carry the same iron weights as those half his age. Each of these images tells us something important. Behind every tool of restraint was a life, a story, a person whose humanity was being denied. And yet, within these dire circumstances, something remarkable persisted. Even with chains on their limbs, many found ways to resist in spirit. They sang songs, soft and low, songs that carried hidden meanings and secret codes. They looked after one another, sharing what little food they had to keep their community alive. They passed down whispered stories of hope, so that even the youngest would know that their lives were worth more than the iron on their bodies. The tools of oppression sought to erase their humanity, but time and again, their humanity endured. When we reflect on this chapter of history, it challenges us to ask uncomfortable questions. How could ordinary people become so accustomed to seeing others chained and silenced? How could such cruelty be accepted as normal? And perhaps the hardest question of all, what injustices today might we overlook simply because they are disguised as routine? The story of chains, muzzles, starvation, and iron weights is not only about the past, it is about recognizing the dangers of forgetting. If cruelty can become normalized once, it can happen again, unless we remain vigilant. Remembering these details honors the strength of those who endured and ensures that their suffering is not erased from memory. These were not just tools of restraint. They were tools of control, of power, of fear. But history also shows us that no chain, however heavy, can fully crush the human spirit. By telling these stories now, we break the silence that once surrounded them. We remind ourselves and each other that dignity, freedom, and truth must never be taken for granted. There is a law, written in the faded ink of the 17th century, that quietly sealed the fate of generations yet unborn. It was called parta sequitur vent rem, Latin words that meant a child would follow the condition of the mother. If the mother was free, so was her child. But if she was not, then her children, and her children's children, would carry the same burden. This law transformed motherhood itself into a tool of control. It turned the cradle into a marketplace, and birth into an economic transaction. On the plantations, life was measured in labor, and labor was measured in bodies. The international slave trade had been cut off in the early 19th century, but the demand for labor did not fade. Cotton still needed to be harvested, rice paddies tended, tobacco fields worked. With no new ships bringing people across the ocean, the solution for those in power was simple and chilling: they would force the population they already had to reproduce. Enslaved men and women, stripped of the right to choose love or family, were treated instead as part of a system that valued them only for their ability to bring forth more laborers. Imagine the world this created. A young woman, perhaps no older than 16, might be singled out not because of her smile or her kindness, but because of her strength and health. She was seen as someone who could bear many children, and so her life was directed not toward her own dreams, but toward producing more lives for the fields. A young man, tall and strong, might be forced into unions with women chosen for him, regardless of his feelings. What should have been moments of intimacy and choice became acts of coercion, dictated by overseers and owners who saw in these pairings only the promise of profit. Children born into this system rarely knew the warmth of a secure family. At birth, they were already marked as property. Some were taken from their mothers before they could even walk, sold to other plantations or distant states. The cry of a child being carried away was not just a personal tragedy, it was a calculated act of commerce. Every new child meant more labor in the future, or more money in the present. Families lived under the shadow of constant separation, never certain if tomorrow would scatter them apart. There were methods, too, of ensuring that children grew into the kind of workers their owners desired. Diets were controlled, not for health, but for strength and endurance. Children were made to run and race, their physical abilities observed like livestock being tested. Those who appeared strong might be valued more highly, while those considered weak were treated as less worthy. Even the act of raising children became an extension of the market, shaping bodies for profit. But within these harsh realities, there were stories of quiet resistance. Mothers sang lullabies that carried coded words of resilience. Fathers, though powerless to change the law, told stories to their children that reminded them they were more than what the world declared them to be. Families created bonds of love and care, even when the system sought to fracture them. These acts of resistance, though small in the moment, preserved something essential, the belief that their children's lives had meaning beyond the fields. The economic stakes of this system were staggering. By the mid-19th century, enslaved people represented billions of dollars in value, more than the farmland, more than the gold and silver, more than almost anything else in the nation. In ledgers and bank records, they were listed not as people, but as assets. Loans were taken with their names as collateral. Bonds were issued and sold in distant cities, built on the backs of their lives. Each new birth, each child marked by the law of partus sequitur vent rem, fed this vast machine of wealth. Yet behind every statistic was a human being. A mother holding her newborn, knowing that joy and terror lived in the same moment. A father watching his son grow strong, fearful that this very strength might draw unwanted attention. A child, just beginning to understand the world, sensing that their future was not theirs to decide. These stories, repeated countless times across countless families, show us the true cost of that system. When we read about these practices today, it can be tempting to think of them as distant, as relics of another world. But their legacy still echoes. The idea that human lives can be reduced to economic value, that families can be fractured for profit, that laws can be written to strip people of choice, these are not just matters of the past. They are reminders of what happens when society forgets to guard the humanity of all its members. The law of partus sequitur vent rem turned generations of children into commodities before they could even speak their first word. It taught people that birth itself could be bought and sold. Yet even in this world of control and calculation, there were sparks of humanity that refused to die out, songs, stories, small acts of defiance that whispered of freedom. And it is those sparks, carried through time, that remind us today of the strength it takes to endure, and the importance of remembering what was once deliberately hidden. In the grand houses of the South, history often paints an image of refinement, white columns rising high, polished floors gleaming in the light, the air filled with the fragrance of magnolia trees. But behind the heavy curtains and closed doors, there existed a reality that rarely found its way into written records. It was a reality where power was not only exercised in the fields by overseers, but also within the private chambers of the household. Here, white women, often perceived as fragile or powerless within their own society, could wield influence in ways that left scars on the lives of the enslaved men forced into their presence. Enslaved men carried the weight of labor on their shoulders, working from dawn until long after dusk. Their bodies bore the marks of toil, their spirits strained by endless demands. They lived under constant surveillance, aware that a single misstep could bring swift punishment. Yet for some, the greatest threat did not come from the overseer's whip or the master's ledger, but from the desires of the very women who lived in the big house. These women, confined by their roles as wives and daughters, sometimes turned to enslaved men not only for hidden gratification but as a means of asserting control in a world where their own authority was limited. The imbalance of power was absolute. An enslaved man had no choice in these encounters. To refuse was unthinkable, for refusal itself could be punished as defiance. A glance, a word, even silence could be twisted into evidence of disobedience. For the man trapped in such circumstances, there was no safe path. To comply was to surrender autonomy. To resist was to invite danger, not just for himself, but for his family, who might be made to pay for his perceived insolence. It is important to understand the dynamics at play. These women lived in a society that denied them many forms of independence. Their marriages were often arranged, their finances controlled by husbands or fathers, their roles restricted to the domestic sphere. Within that confined space, the presence of enslaved men provided an opportunity to reverse the balance of power, if only behind closed doors. What they could not command in public, they could demand in private. And they often directed their attention toward those already most vulnerable, the men whose spirits had been broken by years of hardship, those least able to resist. For the men, these experiences left wounds that went beyond the physical. The loss of dignity, the constant fear of accusation, the inability to protect oneself from unwanted attention, these became lasting burdens. Even the act of showing sadness or anger could be perilous. To display too much emotion might provoke suspicion, while to remain silent was to bury trauma deep inside. Either path was fraught with danger. Imagine a man in his 20s, broad-shouldered from years of work in the fields. He is summoned to the big house, where the lady of the house waits behind drawn curtains. To anyone outside, it might appear as though he has been called for some task, perhaps to move furniture or carry supplies. But once inside, the request is of a different nature. He cannot refuse. The weight of law and custom stands against him. Later, he returns to his cabin in silence, unable to share the truth even with those closest to him, for fear that speaking of it would bring further suffering. The secrecy surrounding these encounters made them all the more insidious. Unlike the public punishments of the fields, which were meant to send a message to the entire community, these private abuses remained hidden, whispered about but rarely spoken aloud. The enslaved men bore the shame in silence, often blamed for circumstances they had no power to control. Meanwhile, the women who initiated these acts could continue to present themselves to the world as models of virtue, untouched by scandal. Yet, even within this hidden realm of oppression, resistance sometimes found subtle forms. Some men learned to feign illness or injury to avoid being summoned. Others sought protection within their community, confiding in elders who counseled them in whispers. These small acts of self-preservation were dangerous, but they reflected an enduring truth. Even when stripped of choice, individuals sought ways to preserve their dignity and humanity. The stories of these abuses are not often told, perhaps because they challenge traditional narratives. They reveal that the power structures of slavery were complex, with layers that extended beyond the master and overseer. They show us that women, too, could wield power in destructive ways, exploiting the very individuals society claimed they had no authority over. And they remind us that the trauma of slavery was not confined to the visible brutality of the fields, but reached into the hidden spaces of homes and hearts. To look back on this history is to confront a difficult reality, that exploitation can take many forms, and that silence can sometimes be as damaging as open violence. These enslaved men were trapped not only by chains and laws, but by the unspoken rules of a society that left them defenseless against private abuse. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes, but as central chapters in the narrative of resilience and survival. Even today, when we walk past the grand houses that still stand in parts of the South, it is worth pausing to reflect on what those walls once concealed. Behind the painted shutters and elegant facades were lives marked by secrets and suffering. To tell these stories now is to give voice to those who could not speak then, to honor their endurance, and to ensure that the hidden truths of history are not lost in silence. On the plantations of the American South, life was governed by rules designed not only to control labor but also to regulate the most private aspects of human existence. For enslaved men, every action was scrutinized, every relationship monitored, every choice stripped of autonomy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of intimacy. Even in moments when two people sought comfort in one another, their lives could be shattered by the gaze of those who saw such closeness as a threat to authority. The system of slavery was built on domination, and one of its central strategies was to deny enslaved men any sense of independence over their own bodies. Power was enforced through constant reminders of vulnerability. If an enslaved man was discovered in a romantic encounter, whether it was an act of genuine affection, or simply two people finding solace in one another, the consequences could be devastating. The reaction was rarely about the act itself, but about the challenge it posed to the order of control. Plantation owners feared the idea of black men experiencing any form of agency, particularly in areas tied to masculinity and selfhood. A relationship, even if mutual and consensual, represented a kind of freedom, an assertion that enslaved men could still claim moments of choice in a world designed to strip them of it. To those in power, this was unacceptable. So punishments were crafted not only to cause suffering, but to send a message, that strength, pride, and dignity would be broken if they dared to step outside the boundaries imposed on them. Imagine the scene, a quiet night after the day's labor, when the fields are still and the cabins lit only by faint lanterns. Two people, drawn together by affection, share a stolen moment. To them, it is an escape from endless days of toil and despair. But to the overseer who discovers them, it is not seen as humanity, it is seen as defiance. And defiance, no matter how small, must be crushed. The punishments that followed were meant to humiliate as much as they were to harm. Public shaming was common, turning private choices into spectacles for others to witness. In this way, the entire community was reminded of the risks of intimacy. It was not enough to discipline the individuals involved, the system demanded that others learn fear from their example. The act of love or attraction was twisted into something dangerous, something that could strip a man of his identity and place him at the mercy of those who claimed ownership over his life. For enslaved men, this created a world of impossible contradictions. To seek companionship was natural, yet it carried the threat of punishment. To deny themselves connection was safer, but it meant living without one of the few remaining comforts in an otherwise brutal existence. The very essence of manhood was undermined. They were not allowed to court openly, to marry freely, or to protect the families they tried to build. The message was clear: their bodies, their choices, their dignity, none of it belonged to them. These punishments also served a broader purpose within the plantation hierarchy. By targeting enslaved men in such a personal way, enslavers reinforced the idea that dominance was absolute. It was not enough to control labor, they sought to control identity itself. Masculinity, strength, and independence, qualities that might inspire resistance, were systematically attacked. The result was an atmosphere where men were made to feel powerless in the most intimate dimensions of their lives. And yet, despite the risks, relationships did form. Men and women still found ways to meet, still whispered words of affection in the dark, still tried to carve out moments of humanity amid inhuman conditions. The fact that they did so at all is a testament to resilience. These were acts of quiet resistance, proof that even under the weight of fear, people sought connection and love. Each relationship was a defiance of the system's attempt to strip them of their humanity. The legacies of these experiences lingered long after. Generations of families bore the scars of lives interrupted, relationships destroyed, dignity stolen. For the men who endured such treatment, the memory of their vulnerability often stayed with them, unspoken but deeply felt. Within their communities, these stories became whispered warnings to the young: be cautious, be guarded, for even the most human of desires could be twisted into a reason for suffering. When we reflect on this history today, it becomes clear how thoroughly the system of slavery sought to control every aspect of life. It was not only about work or profit, it was about erasing selfhood. By punishing men for moments of intimacy, the system struck at the heart of their identity. But the persistence of relationships, the survival of love, and the endurance of family ties despite all efforts to destroy them stand as evidence that humanity could not be completely erased. In the silence of those nights long ago, when two people reached for each other against all odds, there lived a truth the system could never fully extinguish, that even when stripped of freedom, dignity, and choice, the human spirit still searched for connection. And in that search lay a quiet, powerful resistance. In the world of slavery, control was not simply about labor or profit. It was about power, absolute, unquestioned power, enforced in ways designed to break the spirit of entire communities. One of the most harrowing methods used was the deliberate targeting of enslaved men through public humiliation, carried out not in secrecy but before the eyes of those they loved most. These acts were not random, they were calculated performances of dominance, meant to sow fear, suppress resistance, and remind everyone of their vulnerability. On a plantation, power operated like theater. Every act of discipline was staged to send a message. A man accused of defiance, whether real or imagined, might be brought into the center of the yard, with his family and fellow workers forced to gather. They were not there to intervene, they were there to witness. The audience was part of the punishment. Fear was the script, and the enslaver's authority was the performance. The man at the center of it all carried more than his own burden. His dignity, his role as father, husband, or brother, was deliberately attacked. By degrading him in front of his family, the enslaver struck at the foundation of trust and protection that bound their community together. To see a loved one forced into such a position was to understand that no one, not even the strongest, was safe. These acts also carried a deeper message. Enslavers feared rebellion, feared unity among the people they held captive. They understood that strength often came from bonds, between men and women, parents and children, families and friends. To shatter those bonds, they used public humiliation as a weapon. By attacking men in front of their wives, children, and peers, they hoped to fracture the very fabric of solidarity. If a father could not shield his family, if a husband could not protect his wife, the system reinforced the idea that resistance was futile. Imagine the silence that followed such an event. A community standing together, eyes lowered, hearts burning with rage they dared not show. Children too young to understand the details, yet old enough to feel the shame in the air. Wives holding back tears, knowing their pain could not be spoken aloud. And the man himself, forced to endure not only the immediate trauma but also the long echo of being seen, exposed, and powerless before those he loved. This cruelty was psychological as much as physical. It was a way of eroding confidence, of planting doubt in every heart. If the strongest man among them could be reduced to nothing, what chance did anyone else have? The plantation system thrived on this logic, breaking one person publicly so that hundreds would remain silent privately. Terror was more efficient than chains, and humiliation more lasting than whips. And yet, within this deliberate cruelty, there existed a paradox. For while these public assaults were intended to destroy unity, they sometimes ignited quiet forms of resistance. Families who witnessed such horrors did not always turn against the man who suffered, instead, they often closed ranks around him. In whispered conversations at night, in shared meals, in gestures of comfort, they reminded each other that their bonds were stronger than the system's efforts to tear them apart. The very acts meant to sow division could also fuel resilience. Still, the scars were deep. For the men subjected to this violence, the loss of dignity before their families was often unbearable. Many withdrew inward, unable to meet the eyes of their wives or children. Others turned their pain into determination, vowing silently to survive, if only to keep the memory of what was done to them from defining who they truly were. And for the children who witnessed these acts, the lessons were seared into memory, lessons about cruelty, about power, but also about the strength required to endure. History often sanitizes these realities, speaking of discipline and control without acknowledging the brutal methods by which they were enforced. Yet it is impossible to understand the true nature of slavery without recognizing how profoundly it sought to strip people of dignity, not only through labor but through orchestrated humiliation. These public assaults were not accidents of cruelty, they were deliberate strategies, written into the unspoken rules of domination. To tell these stories today is not to dwell on suffering for its own sake. It is to remember the resilience of those who lived through it, to give voice to the silences that were forced upon them. Behind every account of terror lies a story of endurance, of families who continued to hold together, of men who found ways to maintain their humanity even in the face of degradation, of communities that carried forward despite everything designed to break them. The plantation yards are quiet now, the wooden cabins long gone, the voices silenced by time. But if we listen closely to the history that lingers, we hear not just the cruelty but the courage. We hear the unspoken defiance of people who, even when stripped of everything, continued to survive, to love, and to hope. And by remembering them, by speaking the truths they could not, we ensure that their dignity, once denied, endures in memory, untouchable at last. From the moment they opened their eyes to the world, enslaved children were born into a system that sought to define them not as sons and daughters, but as property. Their first cries echoed not with the joy of new life, but with the shadow of a future already decided by laws and customs that reduced them to objects of trade. Unlike free children, whose earliest years were filled with discovery and care, these children were raised under watchful eyes that measured not their laughter, but their potential value. Life for these children often began in cabins where their mothers, themselves bound in servitude, did everything they could to nurture them with love. Songs were whispered at night, quiet lullabies meant to shield them from the harshness of the world outside. Yet even as mothers rocked their infants, they carried the painful knowledge that their children were not theirs to keep. At any moment, a decision made in a distant ledger could separate mother from child, family from family. As soon as these children were old enough to walk, their lives began to take shape around labor. Small tasks, fetching water, gathering kindling, tending to animals, were assigned, not as acts of learning but as the first steps into a life of service. Every action was quietly observed by overseers and owners, who assessed them the way one might examine a young animal for signs of strength or weakness. Childhood, with its innocence and play, was brief, if it existed at all. By the time boys and girls reached adolescence, they were often subjected to tests that revealed how much labor they could endure. A boy might be asked to lift a sack of grain, to see how his muscles bore the weight. A girl might be evaluated for endurance in the fields, or for the roles she might fill in the household. These tests were not acts of mentorship but cold calculations, performed in front of strangers who treated children as investments. The children themselves often did not fully understand what was happening, only that their bodies, their strength, and their futures were being measured in ways that left no room for dreams. The cruelty of this process deepened during the moments when these children were sold. Auction blocks became stages where human lives were displayed, and young boys and girls were presented to buyers as though they were items in a marketplace. Their teeth were inspected, their arms prodded, their backs examined for signs of endurance. Questions were asked not about their favorite games or hopes for the future, but about how many hours they could work under the sun, how many years of labor they might provide. For the children, the experience was bewildering and terrifying. To stand before strangers, to be separated from familiar faces, to hear the sound of numbers shouted in exchange for their lives, these were moments that left scars too deep for words. For their families, the pain was unbearable. Mothers and fathers pleaded, sometimes falling to their knees, begging to keep their children. Their cries were often ignored. With each sale, families were broken apart, and the generational wound deepened. The trauma of these separations rippled through communities. A child who had once played beside siblings might suddenly be gone, carried off to another plantation, another life. The absence was felt not only by parents but by peers, who grew up learning the cruel lesson that love and attachment were dangerous because they could be torn away without warning. This constant uncertainty carved into the hearts of enslaved children, shaping the way they understood the world. And yet, within this harsh reality, resilience endured. Enslaved parents and elders worked tirelessly to give children a sense of identity beyond the labels imposed upon them. They told stories, tales from Africa, parables of hope, and whispers of freedom, that gave children something to hold on to when everything else was unstable. Songs were sung in the fields, not only to pass the time but to remind the young that they belonged to something greater than the plantation, greater than the cruelty around them. The trauma, however, did not end with one generation. Children who were raised in such conditions carried the pain into adulthood. They grew up remembering the fear of being sold, the silence of nights without siblings, the look in their mother's eyes when families were torn apart. These memories shaped the way they lived, the way they parented, the way they dreamed of freedom. The pain was handed down like an heirloom, unasked for but unavoidable, a shadow that stretched across time. When we speak of slavery today, it is often measured in terms of years or labor, but to understand its true impact, we must look at the children. They were not spared, not sheltered, not allowed the innocence of youth. Instead, they were raised under conditions that denied them the very essence of what it means to be a child. Their laughter was cut short, their games interrupted, their futures sold to the highest bidder. And yet, even in such darkness, their humanity endured. The love of mothers who sang lullabies despite knowing what the future might hold. The courage of fathers who taught their children to hold their heads high, even when dignity was denied. The bonds of siblings who clung to each other, if only for a little while, against the tide of separation. These stories remind us that behind every statistic of slavery lies the life of a child who deserved more. They remind us of the resilience passed down through generations, resilience that carried families forward even in the face of unimaginable loss. And they challenge us, today, to remember, not just the suffering, but the strength, the endurance, and the unbreakable will of those who were denied the chance to simply be children, yet still found ways to hold on to hope. In the early days of America's rise, the economy did not simply grow from fertile soil or bustling ports, it was built upon human lives treated as commodities. Enslaved people were not only laborers in the fields, they became the foundation of financial systems that stretched far beyond the plantations. Their bodies, their futures, even their very existence, were transformed into numbers on ledgers and signatures on contracts, shaping a global economy that thrived on their captivity. To understand this, one must picture the world of the plantation owner not merely as a farmer but as a businessman. Tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar brought profits, but land and crops alone could not secure the loans needed to expand operations. Banks, investors, and traders demanded collateral, something valuable, something enduring. And so, enslaved men, women, and children were entered into account books not as individuals but as assets, listed alongside livestock and land, their worth calculated to the dollar. A man's strength in the fields, a woman's potential to bear children, a child's years of labor ahead, these were all translated into financial value. To a banker's eye, they were wealth incarnate, more reliable than land that could fail in drought or harvests that could be ruined by storms. People became guarantees for loans, pledges for debts, security for risky ventures. The plantation itself was only as valuable as the number of lives bound to its soil. This practice did not remain local. Across oceans, in the bustling markets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam, bonds and securities tied to the labor of enslaved people were traded like gold or silver. Investors who never set foot on American soil profited from the sweat and tears of those whose names they would never know. What happened on a quiet plantation in Virginia or South Carolina rippled outward to shape the fortunes of Europe's wealthiest families and institutions. For the enslaved themselves, this reality was a cruel twist of fate. They were not only subject to physical control but financial calculation. A family might live together one year, only to be torn apart the next, sold not because of disobedience or punishment, but because a loan had come due or a banker demanded repayment. A child might be collateral on a debt, their life signed away on a piece of paper sealed in ink. These decisions were made in offices and counting houses far from the fields, but their consequences were felt in the most intimate corners of human life. Consider the irony: while the nation spoke loftily of liberty and independence, its most valuable wealth was bound in chains. At the height of the 19th century, the total value of enslaved people in the United States exceeded that of all the country's railroads, factories, and banks combined. They were, in effect, America's greatest financial asset, bought, sold, leveraged, and securitized in ways that mirrored the stock markets of today. The system was so entrenched that entire institutions depended on it. Insurance companies offered policies to slaveholders to protect their investment against loss. Banks extended credit lines secured not by land but by human beings. Northern merchants, who often claimed moral distance from slavery, quietly profited by financing southern plantations, ensuring that even regions without fields of cotton were tied to the wealth it generated. Slavery was not just a southern institution, it was a national enterprise, knitted into the fabric of the American economy. And beyond America, the world was watching. Ships carried cotton to Britain, where it fed the looms of Manchester and clothed millions. Profits flowed back across the Atlantic, funding railroads, factories, and colonial ventures. In France and the Netherlands, investors bought bonds backed by human labor in distant lands, often unaware, or willfully ignorant, of the suffering that lay behind their dividends. The wealth of nations was, quite literally, built on the backs of enslaved people. For those forced into this system, the knowledge was inescapable. They saw how their worth was tallied in books, how the overseer counted heads not for care but for profit. They lived with the constant awareness that they could be traded, mortgaged, or sold to satisfy the debts of others. Their humanity was invisible to those who handled the paperwork, yet undeniable in the communities they built, the songs they sang, and the quiet resistance they offered in the face of such dehumanization. Generations carried the weight of this financial exploitation. Even after emancipation, the scars remained, not only in the trauma of broken families but in the economic legacy left behind. While banks, investors, and traders amassed wealth that echoed for centuries, those whose labor created it were left with nothing. They built fortunes they would never inherit, economies they would never benefit from. Today, when we speak of the foundations of modern finance, we often look to Wall Street, to industrial revolutions, to innovations in banking. But beneath those narratives lies a deeper truth: enslaved people were not only the labor force of America's rise, they were the capital itself. Their lives were turned into bonds and securities, traded across oceans, shaping the global economy in ways still felt today. It is a story of contradiction, a nation proclaiming freedom while mortgaging it away in human lives. It is a story of silence, where balance sheets hid the cries of children sold to pay debts. And it is a story of endurance, for even in the face of such calculated exploitation, enslaved people held on to their humanity, refusing to be defined solely by the numbers written beside their names. Their value was measured in dollars, but their true worth was immeasurable. And it is that truth, the unbreakable humanity behind the ledgers, that history must never forget. When slavery ended, many believed freedom would bring safety, dignity, and a chance to rebuild shattered lives. But the end of legal bondage did not mean the end of oppression. Instead, a new system of fear rose in its place, one built not on chains and auctions, but on myths and lies carefully crafted to maintain control. Among the most dangerous of these was the false image of the black criminal, particularly the myth of the so-called black man as a threat to white women. This poisonous idea would shape decades of violence, segregation, and terror, becoming one of the most devastating legacies of America's racial history. The myth did not arise by accident. It was a deliberate invention, a weapon designed to justify the continued subjugation of black people after slavery. Southern leaders, unwilling to let go of their former power, spread stories that painted black men as dangerous and uncontrolled. Newspapers published sensationalized accounts, politicians invoked fear in their speeches, and communities whispered rumors meant to keep white citizens anxious and distrustful. These stories, though baseless, spread like wildfire, planting seeds of paranoia that would bloom into some of the darkest chapters of American history. At the center of this myth was fear. Fear that without the strict control of slavery, black communities would rise to claim their rights. Fear that equality would disrupt the old social order. And so, the lie of the black predator became a tool of control, a way to rally white communities around a shared enemy. It did not matter that the vast majority of crimes attributed to black men were fabricated. The accusation itself became a sentence, one that often ended in death. Lynching became the most visible and horrifying expression of this myth. Across the South, mobs gathered in public squares and open fields, dragging men, sometimes even women, into spectacles of violence. These events were not secret crimes committed in the shadows. They were deliberate performances of terror, carried out in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of spectators. Postcards were made, souvenirs sold, as if the destruction of a life were nothing more than entertainment. The myth of the black rapist was the justification, repeated endlessly to rationalize cruelty that otherwise could not be defended. Families lived under constant threat. For a black man, even a glance or a misunderstood word could mean an accusation. A boy brushing too close to a white woman on a sidewalk could become a target. Husbands, brothers, and fathers vanished overnight, taken by mobs before the law could, or would, intervene. Mothers taught their children to avoid eye contact, to move carefully through the world, to never give anyone a reason to accuse. Survival became an art of silence and caution, lived under the shadow of lies too powerful to escape. The violence did not stop with the mob. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan grew in power, wrapping themselves in hoods and crosses, claiming to defend honor and order. In reality, their mission was simple: to maintain white dominance by terror. Night raids, cross burnings, and threats were aimed not only at individuals but entire communities. Every act was a reminder that freedom had limits, that stepping beyond one's place could bring swift and brutal retribution. Segregation laws soon followed, solidifying this racial hierarchy into every corner of daily life. Schools, buses, restaurants, even drinking fountains were divided, with black communities forced into inferior conditions by design. These laws were presented as separate but equal, but in truth, they were another extension of the same myth, the idea that black people were dangerous, unworthy, or incapable of sharing space as equals. Segregation was not simply about distance, it was about reinforcing a story that had been told since the days of slavery, that black lives were lesser, a threat, or a burden. And yet, even in the face of this constant danger, black communities endured. Churches became sanctuaries, offering not just spiritual refuge but also a place to organize and resist. Leaders rose from within, teachers, preachers, activists, who began to challenge the lies head-on. They spoke truth to power, demanding that America live up to its promise of equality. For every mob that sought to silence them, there were voices that refused to fade, voices that carried forward the fight for justice. The myth of the black rapist lingered well into the 20th century, resurfacing in courtrooms and newspapers, shaping laws and policies that criminalized black men disproportionately. It haunted trials, where accusations from white women, even without evidence, could outweigh truth. It echoed in films like The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Klan and spread racist propaganda to audiences nationwide. The damage of these stories was not only in the lives lost but in the fear and suspicion they seeded across generations. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is not only the violence but the silence that surrounded it. For decades, many Americans ignored or even excused these acts, convincing themselves they were necessary to protect society. In doing so, they allowed terror to flourish unchecked. But the victims and their families remembered. Their grief, their resilience, their determination to survive became part of the unspoken history carried in songs, prayers, and whispered stories passed down through generations. To tell these stories today is to confront the lies that fueled them. It is to strip away the myths and reveal the truth, that the terror was never about protection, but about control, never about justice, but about power. By remembering the reality behind the myth, we honor those who suffered under its weight and challenge the falsehoods that continue to echo in subtle forms even now. The end of slavery did not bring true freedom, it simply changed the shape of oppression. But through endurance and resistance, black communities carried the struggle forward, refusing to be defined by the lies told about them. Their fight laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement and beyond, a reminder that truth, though often buried under generations of myth, has the power to rise again. The story of America's rise to power is often told as a tale of courage, innovation, and opportunity. We hear of pioneers who braved the unknown, inventors who reshaped industries, and leaders who claimed to fight for freedom. But hidden beneath those proud narratives lies another truth, a truth carved into the very foundation of the nation. The United States did not simply rise by chance or by virtue alone, its early strength was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people whose labor fueled an empire, even as their suffering was silenced. Every field of cotton that stretched across the South, every tobacco leaf harvested, every brick laid in cities like Washington and New York was a silent witness to this history. The wealth these industries created was not just local, it spread outward, financing banks, shipping companies, factories, and governments. America's economy grew strong enough to rival older nations in Europe, and soon its influence reached across the oceans. Yet in the telling of this story, the hands that made it possible were often erased, their contributions buried under myths of progress and prosperity. The silence was deliberate. To acknowledge the truth would mean confronting not only the cruelty of the past but also the uncomfortable reality of its lasting consequences. And so, textbooks softened the edges of history, classrooms spoke vaguely of labor and trade, and generations grew up unaware of the true cost of the nation's rise. The atrocities remained in the shadows, while the scars they left behind continued to shape lives long after the chains were gone. Systemic racism did not appear suddenly in the modern age, it is the echo of centuries of exploitation. The economic structures built during slavery set patterns that endured. Black communities were locked out of opportunities, their neighborhoods starved of investment, their schools left underfunded. Laws and policies reinforced inequality, ensuring that the wealth created by generations of suffering remained concentrated in the hands of others. This was not simply the residue of history, it was the continuation of it. For many, this hidden truth explains the struggles that persist today. It explains why disparities in wealth, housing, healthcare, and education are not random but rooted in design. It explains why justice has often seemed unequal, why prejudice still lingers in institutions meant to serve all people equally. And it explains why remembering history fully is not an exercise in guilt, but in honesty. Without truth, there can be no reconciliation. Without recognition, there can be no healing. Yet even in the face of erasure, the voices of the past have found ways to be heard. Families kept stories alive, passing them down through song, through faith, through quiet remembrance. Writers, artists, and activists lifted these memories into the public eye, refusing to let them be forgotten. Each act of remembering became a form of resistance, a way to reclaim dignity from a history that had tried to strip it away. And now, we live in a time when these hidden chapters are being uncovered more than ever before. Scholars, filmmakers, and everyday people are demanding that the truth be told, not as a side note but as a central part of America's story. For in the resilience of those who endured, there is not only pain but also a profound lesson, that the human spirit can survive even in the harshest of conditions, and that courage can echo across generations. The rise of the United States to global power cannot be separated from this truth. It was not built only on ideals, but also on exploitation. It grew strong while millions were denied even the simplest freedoms. And though the nation has made great strides toward equality, the shadow of that history still stretches long. To face it is not to weaken the story of America, but to strengthen it, to tell it honestly, to honor those who were silenced, and to learn from the scars left behind. As we close this chapter tonight, remember that history is not only about the past, it is about how we choose to live in the present. We have the power to break cycles, to challenge myths, and to build a future where dignity is not denied but shared. By listening, by learning, by by refusing to look away, we honor those whose lives shaped the nation in ways too long ignored. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe history should be remembered in full and not in fragments, then I invite you to join us. Like this video, share it with others who care about the truth, and subscribe to this channel so together we can continue uncovering the stories that history tried to hide. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. May these stories stay with you, may they inspire reflection, and may they remind us all that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. Good night, and sleep well.